In a small, sleepy town nestled between rolling hills and endless fields, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The mornings were crisp, the afternoons warm, and the evenings painted with hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was here, in this unassuming place, that 12-year-old Emily Parker lived her life. A life filled with curiosity, imagination, and an unshakable belief in the stories her grandfather had once told her. Emily was a bright-eyed girl with a mop of curly brown hair and a smile that could light up even the gloomiest of days. She loved school, not because she enjoyed sitting still for hours or memorizing facts, but because it gave her a chance to learn about the world beyond her tiny town. History class in particular fascinated her. She would sit at her desk, eagerly, raising her hand whenever their teacher, Mr. Grayson, asked a question. To Emily, history wasn't just names and dates. It was a tapestry of real people who had lived extraordinary lives. And no one embodied that idea more than her grandfather. Her grandfather, John Parker, had passed away when Emily was only 6 years old, but his memory remained vivid in her mind. He used to sit by the fireplace on chilly winter nights, holding her close as he recounted tales from his younger days. Most of these stories revolved around his time in the military during World War II. According to him, he'd been part of daring missions, faced fierce battles, and even saved lives. Emily remembered how his eyes sparkled when he spoke about those moments, as though reliving them brought him immense pride. Though she didn't fully understand all the details back then, she soaked up every word like a sponge. On this particular morning, the classroom buzzed with energy. Mr. Grayson stood at the front wearing his usual stern expression. His sharp voice cut through the chatter as he began the lesson. Today, he announced, we'll be discussing heroes of World War II. These individuals risked everything to protect freedom and justice. As he wrote key points on the blackboard, Emily leaned forward, her heart racing with excitement. This was her favorite kind of topic, one where ordinary people became legends. Halfway through the lecture, Mr. Grayson paused and turned to face the class. Does anyone here have a family member who served in the war? He asked. The room fell silent for a moment before a few hesitant hands went up. One boy talked about his great-uncle who worked as a medic, while another mentioned a distant cousin who flew planes. When it seemed like everyone had spoken, Emily slowly raised her hand. Her stomach fluttered with nerves, but she felt compelled to share her story. Yes, Emily, Mr. Grayson said, nodding toward her. Taking a deep breath, Emily began. My grandpa was a war hero, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He told me lots of stories about what he did during the war. He said he fought in big battles and helped save people. Mr. Grayson's eyebrows shot up, and for a moment he simply stared at her. Then a smirk spread across his face. Really now? He replied, his tone dripping with skepticism. Your grandfather? A war hero? What exactly did he do? Emily hesitated, suddenly aware of all the eyes fixed on her. I don't remember all the details, she admitted, but he said he was brave and did important things. The smirk on Mr. Grayson's face grew wider. Brave, you say? He repeated mockingly. Emily, your grandfather was a farmer. Everyone knows that. Are you sure you're not confusing bedtime stories with reality? A wave of embarrassment washed over Emily. Her cheeks burned red and tears pricked the corners of her eyes. No, I'm not making it up, she protested, her voice rising. He really was a hero. By now, the entire class was watching intently, some snickering quietly at her expense. Mr. Grayson's expression darkened. Enough of this nonsense, he snapped. Without warning, he stepped forward and slapped Emily hard across the face. The sound echoed through the silent room like a thunderclap. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Emily sat there, stunned, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch her stinging cheek. The other students gasped, their eyes wide with shock. No one dared to speak. Even Mr. Grayson appeared taken aback by his own actions, though he quickly masked his surprise with anger. Now listen carefully, he growled, glaring at Emily. You will not disrupt my class with ridiculous lies. Do you understand? Tears, streamed down Emily's face as she nodded mutely, too overwhelmed to respond. Inside, however, something inside her hardened. She knew her grandfather's stories weren't lies. They couldn't be. But how could she prove it to someone like Mr. Grayson? As the lesson resumed, Emily retreated into herself, her earlier enthusiasm replaced by a heavy sadness. The rest of the day passed in a blur, each hour feeling longer than the last. By the key, time. The final bell rang. She couldn't wait to escape the confines of the school building. As she walked home, clutching her backpack tightly, she replayed the incident over and over in her mind. Why hadn't anyone stood up for her? Why did Mr. Grayson refuse to believe her? Little did Emily know, this humiliating moment would set off a chain of events that would change not only her life, but also the way her entire town viewed her beloved grandfather. For now, though, all she wanted was to crawl into bed and forget the day ever happened. Yet deep down, a spark of determination flickered within her. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and when it did, the world would finally know just how heroic her grandfather truly was. By the time Emily reached home that afternoon, the news of what had happened in Mr. Grayson's classroom had already begun to spread like wildfire. Gossip traveled fast in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Parents picked up their children from school and immediately started discussing the incident. Some had heard snippets directly from their kids, while others pieced together details secondhand. By evening, the story had taken on a life of its own, with each retelling adding new layers of drama. Emily's mother, Sarah Parker, was one of the last people to hear about it. She worked part-time at the local bakery and spent most of her day kneading dough, baking pies, and chatting with customers. When she finally returned home, she found Emily curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow tightly. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her usual cheerful demeanor was nowhere to be seen. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, sitting down beside her daughter. At first, Emily hesitated, unsure if she wanted to relive the painful memory. But when her mother gently pressed her for answers, the dam broke. Through sobs and sniffles, Emily recounted everything: how she'd proudly shared her grandfather's stories, how Mr. Grayson had mocked her, and how he'd ultimately struck her in front of the entire class. Sarah listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief, then to outright fury. "He did what?" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger. "That man hit you? In front of your classmates?" Emily nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't lie, Mom," she whispered. "Grandpa really was a hero. I know he was." Sarah pulled her daughter into a tight hug, stroking her hair soothingly. "Of course he was, sweetheart," she said firmly, "and we're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." The next morning, Sarah marched straight to the school principal's office, dressed in her best clothes, a modest blouse, and slacks. She looked every bit the determined mother ready to fight for her child. Principal Thompson, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a perpetually harried expression, greeted her politely but seemed unprepared for the storm that was about to unfold. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah began, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "I need to talk to you about something very serious. My daughter came home yesterday traumatized because her teacher physically assaulted her in class." Principal Thompson's eyes widened slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. "Assaulted her?" he echoed, clearly caught off guard. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Parker? Mr. Grayson is a respected educator." "I'm absolutely sure," Sarah interrupted, her tone firm. He slapped her across the face in front of the entire class. "And why?" "Because she dared to say her grandfather was a war hero." "A war hero, Mr. Thompson. How dare anyone lay a hand on my child for speaking the truth?" The principal stammered, visibly uncomfortable. After a long pause, he promised to look into the matter. But as Sarah left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that her words hadn't truly sunk in. Over the next few days, it became increasingly clear that the school administration wasn't taking the situation seriously. They claimed they needed time to investigate, but Sarah suspected they were simply trying to sweep the issue under the rug. Meanwhile, the town itself was divided. Conversations in grocery stores, coffee shops, and church gatherings revolved around the controversy. Some residents sided with Sarah and Emily, outraged that a teacher would resort to violence over such a trivial matter. Even if the girl exaggerated, hitting her was completely unacceptable, one parent argued during a heated discussion at the diner. Others, however, defended Mr. Grayson, insisting that discipline was necessary to maintain order in schools. Kids these days think they can say whatever they want without consequences, another neighbor remarked dismissively. For Emily, the backlash was almost unbearable. She tried to keep her head down at school, avoiding eye contact with both her classmates and teachers, but whispers followed her wherever she went. Some students teased her mercilessly, calling her a liar and mocking her for getting her teacher in trouble. Others offered quiet support, slipping notes into her locker or sitting with her at lunch. Still, the weight of the ridicule pressed heavily on her shoulders, making her feel isolated and misunderstood. At home, Sarah did her best to shield Emily from the chaos. She encouraged her daughter to focus on her studies and reminded her daily that her grandfather's legacy was worth defending. Together, they sifted through old boxes stored in the attic, searching for any mementos or documents that might prove John Parker's heroism. Though they found faded photographs, letters, and even a dusty medal tucked away in an envelope, none of it seemed substantial enough to convince skeptics like Mr. Grayson. Desperate for help, Sarah decided to reach out to local media outlets. She wrote heartfelt emails and made phone calls, explaining the injustice her family was facing and asking if anyone would be willing to tell their story. For days, there was no response. Just as Sarah began to lose hope, a young reporter named Lisa Martinez agreed to meet with them. Lisa had grown up in the same town and remembered John Parker fondly as the kind farmer who always waved hello. Intrigued by the possibility of uncovering a hidden hero, she promised to dig deeper. As Lisa began investigating, curiosity about John Parker's past grew among the townspeople. Older residents started sharing their own memories of him, how he'd been quiet and humble, rarely speaking about his wartime experiences. A few recalled hearing rumors that he'd done something remarkable during the war, though no one could provide concrete details. The more Lisa uncovered, the more convinced she became that there was more to John Parker than met the eye. But just as momentum seemed to build, doubt crept back in. Without definitive proof, many continued to question whether Emily's claims held any merit. Was her grandfather truly a war hero, or were his stories merely tall tales meant to entertain a young granddaughter? The uncertainty lingered like a cloud over the town, casting shadows of doubt on Sarah and Emily's efforts. One evening, as Sarah tucked Emily into bed, she noticed the same spark of determination in her daughter's eyes that she'd seen the day after the incident. Despite everything, Emily refused to give up. "Mom," she said softly, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. "We'll find a way to show everyone the truth, right?" Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied. "We will. Your grandpa deserves to have his story told, and we won't stop until it is." Unbeknownst to either of them, fate was already setting the stage for a dramatic twist, one that would not only vindicate Emily and restore her grandfather's honor, but also bring an unexpected ally into their lives. All they could do now was wait and hold on to hope. The days that followed were a blur of frustration and uncertainty for Sarah and Emily. Despite their efforts to gather evidence about John Parker's wartime heroism, the town remained divided. Some people began to doubt whether there was any truth to Emily's claims, while others simply grew tired of the controversy altogether. Even Lisa Martinez, the reporter who had initially shown interest in their story, seemed to hit a dead end. She called Sarah one evening, sounding apologetic as she explained that without concrete proof, official records, eyewitness accounts, or something undeniable, it would be difficult to publish anything substantial. "We're trying our best," Lisa said gently, "but it feels like we're missing a key piece of the puzzle. If only there was someone who could confirm what your father did during the war." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I understand," she replied, though disappointment tinged her voice. "Thank you for trying, Lisa." After hanging up, Sarah sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of the situation press down on her. She glanced at Emily, who sat quietly at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album filled with pictures of her grandfather. The little girl looked so small, so fragile, yet there was a quiet resilience in her eyes that made Sarah's heart ache. How could they convince the world of something they themselves believed with every fiber of their being? That night, as Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind drifted back to her own childhood memories of her father. She remembered how he used to take her fishing by the lake, his weathered hands steady as he baited her hook. He rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, his voice carried a gravity that demanded attention. Sarah recalled asking him once why he didn't talk about those days more often. His response had been simple. "Some things are too big for words, sweetheart. You just live with them." As dawn broke the next morning, Sarah decided to visit her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had known her father since before the war. Maybe, just maybe, the older woman might have some insight, or even know someone who could shed light on John Parker's past. Mrs. Henderson greeted Sarah warmly, inviting her inside and offering her a cup of tea. As they sat together in the cozy living room, surrounded by knickknacks and faded photographs, Sarah broached the subject carefully. "Do you remember anything about my dad's time in the military?" she asked. "Anything at all?" Mrs. Henderson leaned back in her chair, her wrinkled face thoughtful. "Oh, I remember bits and pieces," she said slowly. "Your father never liked to brag, but I do recall him mentioning one name, a man he served alongside, Chuck Norris." Sarah froze, nearly spilling her tea. "Chuck Norris?" she repeated, incredulous. "The Chuck Norris? The actor?" Mrs. Henderson nodded, a twinkle in her eye. "That's right. Apparently they were close during the war. Your father saved his life once, or so he told me. Said it was one of the bravest things he'd ever seen anyone do." For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. It sounded almost too incredible to believe. But if there was even a sliver of truth to Mrs. Henderson's recollection, it could be the breakthrough they desperately needed. Thanking the elderly woman profusely, Sarah hurried home, her mind racing with possibilities. Later that day, sitting at the kitchen table with Emily, Sarah shared what she'd learned. The little girl's eyes widened in awe. "Chuck Norris knows Grandpa?" she exclaimed, her voice filled with wonder. "It looks that way," Sarah replied, smiling despite herself. "But we don't know for sure yet. We need to find a way to contact him." Reaching out to a celebrity like Chuck Norris felt daunting, but Sarah refused to let fear stop her. With Emily's help, she drafted a heartfelt letter explaining their situation. They included copies of the photographs and letters they'd found in the attic, along with a plea for assistance. Addressing the envelope to Chuck Norris's official fan club, they mailed it off the very next day, hoping against hope that it would reach him. Weeks passed without a response. Just as Sarah and Emily began to lose hope, an unexpected knock came at their door one crisp autumn afternoon. When Sarah opened it, she was greeted by a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a cowboy hat and a warm smile. For a moment, she didn't recognize him, but then it clicked. Standing on her doorstep was none other than Chuck Norris himself. "Mrs. Parker?" he said, tipping his hat politely. "My name is Chuck Norris. I received your letter." Sarah stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Behind her, Emily peeked around the corner, her jaw dropping in astonishment. Finally finding her voice, Sarah stammered, "Mr. Norris, I can't believe you're here." Chuck chuckled softly, his deep voice carrying a sense of calm authority. "Please call me Chuck, and trust me, after reading your letter, I knew I had to come. Your father, John Parker, was a remarkable man. He saved my life, and I've never forgotten it." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she ushered him inside. Over cups of coffee, Chuck recounted the story of how he and John had met during the war. They'd been part of the same unit, tasked with a dangerous mission behind enemy lines. When their group was ambushed, chaos erupted. Many soldiers fell, including Chuck, who had been wounded and pinned down under heavy fire. "That's when your father stepped in," Chuck continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He ran straight into the line of fire, dragging me to safety and taking out several enemies in the process. Without him, I wouldn't be here today." Emily listened intently, her admiration for her grandfather growing with every word. "So, Grandpa really was a hero," she whispered, her voice trembling with pride. Chuck nodded solemnly. "He was more than that. He was a true patriot. Humble, courageous, and selfless. I tried to stay in touch with him after the war, but life got in the way. Still, I always remembered what he did for me." Moved by his words, Sarah thanked Chuck profusely, tears streaming down her face. "You have no idea what this means to us," she said. "Everyone doubted us, but now we finally have proof." Chuck promised to help however he could. He offered to speak publicly about John Parker's heroism, ensuring that his legacy would be honored. Before leaving, he knelt down beside Emily and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Never forget who your grandfather was," he told her, "and never let anyone make you doubt the truth. Heroes like him deserve to be remembered." Gear. Chuck drove away. Sarah and Emily stood on the porch watching until his car disappeared from view. For the first time in weeks, they felt a glimmer of hope, not just for justice but for vindication. Their battle wasn't over yet, but with Chuck Norris on their side, they knew they had a fighting chance to set the record straight. The town buzzed with excitement when news of Chuck's arrival spread. People gathered in hushed groups, whispering about the legendary actor's involvement in the controversy. Skeptics began to waver, while supporters rallied around the Parkers with renewed vigor. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The tide was turning, and John Parker's story was about to take center stage. The arrival of Chuck Norris in their quiet little town felt like something out of a movie. People who had never paid much attention to the controversy suddenly found themselves drawn into the unfolding drama. Whispers about the legendary actor's visit spread like wildfire, and by the time the school board meeting was called to address Emily's case, the room was packed to capacity. Parents, teachers, students, reporters, and curious townsfolk filled every available seat, with some even standing along the walls. The air buzzed with anticipation as everyone waited for Chuck Norris to make his entrance. When he finally walked in, the crowd erupted into murmurs and gasps. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, Chuck carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had made him an icon on screen. He nodded politely at those around him, shaking hands and exchanging brief greetings before taking his seat near the front. Beside him sat Sarah and Emily, both looking nervous but hopeful. Emily clutched her mother's hand tightly, her wide eyes darting between Chuck and the sea of unfamiliar faces. As the meeting began, Principal Thompson called the room to order, his voice barely audible over the excited chatter. One by one, members of the school board gave their statements, attempting to justify their initial reluctance to take action against Mr. Grayson. Some argued that discipline was necessary to maintain order, while others admitted they hadn't fully understood the gravity of the situation. It was clear, however, that no one expected what came next. When it was Chuck's turn to speak, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him as he stood up, adjusting the microphone to his height. For a moment, he simply stood there, surveying the audience with a calm, steady gaze. Then, in a deep, commanding voice, he began to share the story of John Parker. "Many of you may not know this," he started, "but I owe my life to the man you've been calling a liar." The crowd leaned forward, hanging on to his every word. Chuck recounted the harrowing details of the mission during World War II, the ambush, the chaos, the moments when survival seemed impossible. He described how John Parker had risked everything to save him, running through enemy fire without hesitation. His words painted a vivid picture of courage and sacrifice, leaving many in the audience visibly moved. "He didn't do it for glory or recognition," Chuck continued. "In fact, he never spoke about it unless someone asked. That's the kind of man he was, humble, selfless, and brave. To dismiss his legacy because it wasn't documented in flashy headlines is a disservice to history itself." To drive his point home, Chuck produced a folder containing photographs, letters, and military records that confirmed John Parker's heroism. Among them was a handwritten commendation from a high-ranking officer praising John's actions during the war. There were also faded newspaper clippings from the 1940s, highlighting his unit's success in critical missions. Most striking of all was a medal tucked inside a protective sleeve, a Purple Heart awarded posthumously after bureaucratic errors delayed its delivery for decades. "This isn't just a story," Chuck said firmly, holding up the medal for everyone to see. "This is proof. Proof that John Parker was a hero, and proof that his granddaughter has every right to be proud of him." The impact of his words rippled through the room. Parents exchanged guilty glances, realizing they had doubted Emily unfairly. Teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware of the weight of Chuck's testimony. Even Mr. Grayson, sitting stiffly at the far end of the table, looked pale and shaken. When Chuck finished speaking, the room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls like a thunderous wave. But Chuck wasn't done yet. Turning to face Mr. Grayson directly, he addressed him with a tone that was both firm and compassionate. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice cutting through the lingering cheers, "I understand that teaching can be challenging and maintaining discipline is important, but nothing, not frustration, not skepticism, gives you the right to strike a child. Especially not for defending the honor of someone she loves." Mr. Grayson stared down at the table, unable to meet Chuck's piercing gaze. For the first time since the incident, he seemed truly remorseful. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I thought she was lying." Chuck shook his head. "It doesn't matter what you thought. What matters is that you failed to listen. You failed to give Emily the respect she deserved. And now, because of your actions, a young girl has suffered more than she ever should have." The room grew eerily quiet as Chuck's words sank in. Even those who had initially defended Mr. Grayson couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the tide had turned completely. The school board issued a formal apology to Emily and her family, promising to implement better training programs for educators to prevent similar incidents in the future. Mr. Grayson, overwhelmed by shame and public pressure, submitted his resignation later that evening. For Emily, the revelation brought a mix of emotions. As she sat beside Chuck, listening to the applause and seeing the admiration in people's eyes, she felt a sense of vindication she hadn't known was possible. At the same time, tears streamed down her face, not just because her grandfather's heroism had finally been acknowledged, but because she realized how much love and support surrounded her. Her mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, while Chuck patted her gently on the back. "You did good, kiddo," he told her with a warm smile. "Your grandpa would be so proud of you." That night, as the town processed the events of the day, conversations shifted dramatically. No longer were people debating whether Emily's claims were true. Instead, they marveled at the extraordinary life of John Parker and wondered why his story had remained hidden for so long. Inspired by Chuck's visit, several veterans in the community came forward with their own memories of serving alongside him. One elderly man recalled how John had once shared his rations with starving civilians, while another remembered him volunteering for dangerous reconnaissance missions without complaint. The following morning, local newspapers ran front-page stories about the unfolding saga, complete with quotes from Chuck Norris and photographs of the documents he'd presented. National media outlets soon picked up the story, turning John Parker's legacy into a symbol of unsung heroism. Letters poured in from across the country, many expressing gratitude for shining a light on forgotten heroes like him. For Emily, the newfound attention was overwhelming, but empowering. She no longer felt ashamed or afraid to talk about her grandfather. Instead, she embraced her role as the keeper of his memory, determined to ensure that his sacrifices would never be forgotten. With Chuck's guidance, she began working on a school project about her grandfather's life, weaving together the stories she'd heard as a child with the evidence uncovered during their quest for justice. As the days turned into weeks, the town rallied around the Parker family, organizing a special ceremony to honor John Parker's contributions. Veterans, students, and community members gathered in the park, where a plaque bearing his name was unveiled beneath a towering oak tree. Speeches were given, wreaths were laid, and tears were shed as people paid tribute to the farmer-turned-hero who had quietly shaped their lives in ways they hadn't fully appreciated until now. Through it all, Emily stood tall, her head held high. She knew that her grandfather's legacy was secure, not just in the hearts of those who loved him, but in the annals of history itself. And though Chuck Norris eventually returned to his busy life, his unexpected appearance in their small town left an indelible mark. To Emily, he wasn't just a celebrity. He was a guardian angel who had helped restore her faith in truth, justice, and the enduring power of heroes. The days following the school board meeting and Chuck Norris's revelation brought a wave of change to the small town. What had once been a divided community now found itself united under a shared sense of purpose, honoring John Parker's legacy. The ceremony planned in his memory became more than just an event. It was a turning point for everyone involved. For Emily, it marked the beginning of healing, while for the townspeople it served as a reminder of the importance of listening, believing, and valuing each other's stories. Preparations for the ceremony were underway within days. Volunteers poured in from all corners of the town, eager to contribute. Some helped design posters and flyers, others baked pies and cakes for the reception, and a few even worked on restoring old photographs of John Parker to display at the event. The local church choir offered to perform patriotic songs, and veterans stepped forward to share their own memories of serving alongside him. It was as if the entire town had come alive with energy, determined to make this tribute unforgettable. Emily threw herself into the preparations with enthusiasm. She spent hours poring over the documents Chuck had provided, piecing together a timeline of her grandfather's life. With her mother's help, she created a presentation that included photographs, letters, and excerpts from military records. She also wrote a heartfelt speech, practicing it repeatedly until she could recite it without stumbling over her words. Though the thought of speaking in front of such a large crowd made her nervous, she knew it was something she had to do, for her grandfather and for herself. On the morning of the ceremony, the park buzzed with activity. Rows of white chairs were set up beneath the sprawling oak tree where the plaque would be unveiled. American flags fluttered gently in the breeze, adding a touch of solemnity to the scene. A podium stood at the center, adorned with flowers and a framed photograph of John Parker in his military uniform. As people began to arrive, they greeted one another warmly, exchanging hugs and handshakes. Even those who hadn't known John personally felt a deep connection to the man whose story had inspired so much reflection. When Chuck Norris arrived, the crowd erupted into applause. He smiled humbly, tipping his hat as he took his seat near the front. Beside him sat Sarah and Emily, both dressed in their finest clothes. Emily wore a blue dress that had belonged to her grandmother, its color symbolizing loyalty and courage. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a folded piece of paper, the speech she had written, but her determination outweighed her nerves. As the ceremony began, a hush fell over the gathering. The pastor of the local church opened with a prayer, thanking God for the sacrifices of brave men like John Parker. Then, one by one, speakers took the stage to share their thoughts. Veterans recounted tales of camaraderie and bravery, emphasizing how John's quiet strength had inspired those around him. Teachers praised Emily for her resilience and reminded the audience of the importance of supporting children through difficult times. Each story added depth to the portrait of a man who had lived simply but left an indelible mark on those he touched. When it was finally Emily's turn to speak, she walked slowly to the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. The sea of faces staring back at her seemed endless, but she focused on the photograph of her grandfather behind her, drawing strength from his steady gaze. Taking a deep breath, she began. "My grandpa wasn't famous," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He didn't win awards or appear in movies. But to me, he was a hero long before I knew about the medals or the battles. He taught me how to fish, how to plant seeds in the garden, and how to believe in myself. He told me stories about his time in the war, not to boast, but to remind me that even ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement. Encouraged by their support, Emily continued. When Mr. Grayson hit me, I felt like no one believed me. I felt scared and alone. But then someone did believe me. Someone who knew my grandpa better than anyone else. Chuck Norris came here to tell the truth about my grandpa. And because of him, we know now that heroes don't always wear capes or have their names in history books. Sometimes they're farmers who quietly serve their country and come home to live humble lives. By the time she finished, tears glistened in the eyes of nearly everyone present. Applause broke out, filling the air with warmth and admiration. Chuck stood up briefly, raising his hand to acknowledge the crowd's gratitude, but he quickly gestured for them to focus on Emily. It was her moment, and she had earned it. After the speeches, the plaque was unveiled. Inscribed on it were the words, "In loving memory of John Parker, a true hero who served his country and community with courage and humility." Beneath the inscription was a quote attributed to John himself, taken from one of the letters found in the attic. "A good deed done quietly is worth more than 1,000 shouted victories." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the park, the ceremony transitioned into a celebration. People mingled freely, sharing food, laughter, and stories. Veterans swapped jokes and reminisced about old times, while children ran around playing tag beneath the trees. Emily moved among the guests, accepting hugs and kind words from strangers and friends alike. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly happy. A weight lifted off her shoulders. Chuck spent much of the afternoon talking with Emily and her mother. He encouraged Emily to keep pursuing her passion for history, suggesting that she might one day become a writer or researcher dedicated to uncovering hidden heroes like her grandfather. "Stories matter," he told her earnestly. "They connect us to our past and teach us how to be better in the future. Don't ever stop telling yours." Before leaving, Chuck pulled Emily aside for a private moment. From his pocket, he produced a small keepsake, a signed photograph of himself alongside a note that read, "To Emily, the bravest girl I know. Never forget who you are or where you come from. Your grandpa would be proud." Emily hugged him tightly, overwhelmed by his kindness. As the evening drew to a close, the town dispersed, carrying with them a renewed sense of pride and unity. Conversations sparked by the ceremony continued long after the event ended. Inspiring discussions about preserving local history and recognizing unsung heroes. The controversy that had once divided the community had transformed into a catalyst for growth and understanding. For Emily, the journey had changed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. She no longer feared speaking up or standing tall when faced with adversity. Instead, she embraced her role as the keeper of her grandfather's legacy, determined to ensure that his name and the values he embodied would endure for generations to come. And though Chuck Norris returned to his busy life, his impact lingered, reminding everyone that sometimes the most unlikely heroes can leave the greatest impressions. Months passed since the ceremony, and life in the small town slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The fields were tilled once more, the school bells rang on schedule, and the sun rose and set over the hills just as it always had. But something fundamental had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. The memory of John Parker, the humble farmer and unsung war hero, was now etched into the hearts of everyone who called the town home. His legacy wasn't confined to dusty archives or faded photographs. It lived on in the stories people told, the lessons they learned, and the way they chose to treat one another. Emily, now a year older and wiser, carried herself with newfound confidence. The shy girl who had once hesitated to raise her hand in class had transformed into someone unafraid to share her thoughts. Her teachers noticed the change, too. She participated eagerly in discussions, especially during history lessons, where she often shared insights about World War II and the sacrifices made by soldiers like her grandfather. Her classmates, who had once teased her mercilessly, now listened intently when she spoke. Some even approached her after class to ask questions about her grandfather's story, their curiosity genuine and respectful. One crisp autumn morning, Emily stood at the front of her new history class, this time as the guest speaker. Her teacher, Mrs. Adler, a kind woman who had replaced Mr. Grayson, had invited her to talk about her grandfather's life and the events that unfolded earlier that year. As Emily faced her peers, she felt a flutter of nerves but also a deep sense of pride. Clutching a folder filled with photographs and documents, she began her presentation. "My grandpa wasn't perfect," she started, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "He made mistakes just like anyone else. But what made him special was his heart. He cared deeply about doing the right thing even if no one was watching." She went on to recount the details of his bravery during the war, using Chuck Norris's testimony and the military records to paint a vivid picture of his heroism. When she finished, the room erupted into applause and several students raised their hands to ask thoughtful questions. Afterward, Mrs. Adler pulled Emily aside and praised her for her courage. "You've inspired all of us," she said warmly. "Not just with your grandfather's story, but with how you handled everything that happened. You're proof that standing up for what you believe in can make a difference." The impact of John Parker's story extended far beyond the classroom. Inspired by the ceremony and the media coverage that followed, the town established an annual event called Honoring Our Hidden Heroes. Each year, residents nominated individuals whose quiet acts of kindness or bravery deserved recognition. Whether it was a neighbor who volunteered tirelessly at the food bank, a firefighter who saved lives without seeking praise, or a teacher who went above and beyond for their students, these everyday heroes were celebrated in a community gathering, similar to the one held for John Parker. For Emily, the first event was particularly meaningful. She helped organize it alongside her mother and a group of volunteers, ensuring that every detail, from the speeches to the decorations, reflected the spirit of gratitude and unity that had defined her grandfather's tribute. On the day of the event, she stood proudly beside her mother as they unveiled a mural dedicated to local heroes, including her grandfather. Painted by a talented artist in the community, the mural depicted scenes of ordinary people performing extraordinary deeds, with John Parker's likeness prominently featured in the center. As the years went by, Emily's passion for history only grew stronger. Encouraged by Chuck Norris's advice, she began researching other forgotten heroes from World War II and beyond. She scoured libraries, interviewed veterans, and wrote essays detailing their contributions. One of her projects, a detailed account of a little-known battalion that played a crucial role in liberating a French village, earned her top honors in a statewide competition. When she accepted her award, she dedicated it to her grandfather, saying, "This is for Grandpa, who taught me that true heroes don't seek fame. They simply do what's right." Her achievements didn't go unnoticed. Teachers and mentors encouraged her to pursue a career in historical research or writing, believing she had a unique gift for bringing untold stories to light. By the time she graduated high school, Emily had already decided to study history in college, determined to spend her life uncovering and preserving the legacies of those who might otherwise be forgotten. Meanwhile, the town continued to thrive under the shadow of John Parker's influence. Conversations around dinner tables and coffee shops often turned to themes of humility, sacrifice, and the importance of listening to others. Parents reminded their children of Emily's bravery, urging them to stand up for themselves and speak the truth, even when it was difficult. Teachers adopted new approaches to discipline, prioritizing empathy and understanding over punishment. And though Mr. Grayson's name was rarely mentioned, his actions served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing someone's words without consideration. Chuck Norris remained a beloved figure in the town, even years after his visit. People still talked about the day he arrived unannounced, ready to defend a young girl's honor. For Emily, he became more than just a celebrity. He was a mentor and a friend. They kept in touch through letters and occasional phone calls, during which Chuck offered guidance and encouragement as she pursued her dreams. In one letter he wrote, "Heroes come in all shapes and sizes, Emily. Some wear capes, some wear uniforms, and some wear work boots. What matters is the mark they leave on the world, and I have no doubt you'll leave a big one. Years later, when Emily graduated from college with honors, Chuck surprised her by attending the ceremony. Standing tall in his cowboy hat, he joined Sarah in cheering her on as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma. Afterward, they posed for photographs together, with Emily clutching her degree and grinning ear to ear. It was a moment she would treasure forever, a testament to the journey she had taken and the people who had supported her along the way. Looking back on everything that had happened, Emily realized that her grandfather's story had done more than restore his honor. It had changed lives. It had brought her closer to her mother, united a divided town, and introduced her to a mentor who believed in her potential. Most importantly, it had taught her that truth and courage could overcome even the greatest challenges. Though John Parker was no longer physically present, his spirit lived on in the values he had instilled in those who loved him. And so, as Emily embarked on the next chapter of her life, she carried with her not only her grandfather's memory, but also the lessons he had taught her, to be brave, to be kind, and to never stop fighting for what was right. In doing so, she ensured that his legacy, and the legacy of countless others like him, would endure for generations to come.